Hello there everyone, my name is David Lutchford and today I'm going to be teaching you lesson 12 of my Ancient Greek course, and today's lesson is on the genitive case. And as you can see, it's going to be an introduction to the genitive case. I shall create a more in-depth video on the genitive case in the future, but today we're just going to be looking at the main use of the genitive case, and we're also going to be looking at the three ways in which genitives can be deployed in sentences. Genitives being nouns in the genitive case. And in our case, no pun intended, those nouns are going to be accompanied by definite articles, since we are still using the definite article as a key at the moment. So we know that if the definite article is in the masculine genitive singular, for instance, then the noun must also be in the masculine genitive singular. We shall cover how nouns change their endings in the future. But for now, let's get started with the genitive case. And we shall start by learning the main use of the genitive case. And I'm pleased to say that it's relatively straightforward to learn the main use of the genitive case because you just have to remember one word. And that word is of. The genitive case is primarily used to mean of. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I'm saying is if you have a noun in the genitive case, then you should translate that noun using the word of. That is, when you translate the noun, you put the word of before the noun. So for example, if you had the slave in the genitive case, then you would translate it as of the slave. If a word's in the genitive, then stick the word of before it. The genitive is mainly used to mean of. That is the basic meaning of the case. But the genitive case does have some other uses, and that means that you can't translate every single genitive noun by sticking the word of before it. In some cases, it would be wrong to translate a genitive noun using the word of, but for now, all of the genitive nouns we meet will be genitive because they mean of that noun in some sense. So in summary, the basic meaning or the main use of the genitive is of. If you see a noun in the genitive, then translate it with the word of before it. Let's look at an example. But just before I show you said example, make sure that you know the forms of the definite article, because then you'll be able to recognize which nouns are in the genitive, since you'll be using the definite article as a key in this lesson. So if you know your forms of the definite article, then you will know that the masculine genitive singular form of the definite article is tu, and that the feminine genitive singular form of the definite article is ters, and that the neuter genitive singular form of the definite article is tu. So the masculine and neuter genitive singular forms are identical to each other. And then in the genitive plural, it's even more straightforward because every genitive plural form of the definite article, that is, the masculine, feminine, and neuter genitive plural forms of the definite article, are torn. So if you see the form of the definite article torn being used, you know that it is genitive plural. However, you would have to see which noun it is going with to know its gender. You would need the context to determine the gender of torn, since it's identical in all three genders. And likewise, you would need the context to know the gender of tu, whether it's masculine or neuter. If it's going with a neuter noun, then it's neuter, but if it's going with a masculine noun, then it's masculine. But anyway, please make sure you know all of the forms of the definite article. Okay, here we have an example of a phrase which uses a genitive, definite article, and noun. And the whole phrase is chodoulos tou despotou. And we know that the start of this phrase is not genitive, because we know that ho is the masculine nominative singular form of the definite article, and therefore chodoulos must be masculine nominative singular. And we know this means the slave. So the slave must be the subject in the sentence, but we only have a phrase here, we don't have any verb. But if there were a full sentence, we know he would be the subject. So we know this says the slave, but what about this tou despotou part? Well, we know that tou is either the masculine genitive singular form of the definite article or the neuter genitive singular form of the definite article. we can see that it's going with the noun despoters, here despotou, because it's not in the nominative here. And so, because we know despoters is a masculine noun, we know that tou here is the masculine genitive singular form of the definite article, because it's applying to a masculine noun. And that tells us that despotou is also masculine genitive singular. And given what I've told you about the main use of the genitive, the way that we translate this phrase, literally, is the slave of the master. So that is how we literally translate this phrase, the slave of the master. Because tou despotou is in the genitive, we have just put of before it in our translation. So we might ask ourselves, what sense of the word of is being used here? What we mean when we say the slave of the master is that the master owns that slave. So this is of in the sense of possession. And that's one of the senses of that the genitive can be used to mean. There are others, but today we're just looking at possession. So this phrase is what we would call a possessive genitive, or a genitive of possession, because it's being used to tell us that the slave is owned by the master, that he is the slave of the master. And now in English, if somebody owns something, we don't typically use the word of. Although I've told you to translate the genitive literally using the word of, which you most definitely should, in cases of possession, if somebody owns something, then there's something we can do in English to make it sound slightly nicer and more natural. Can you think of what it might be? How can we make the slave of the master sound more natural in English? Because it sounds a little bit clunky. You may have realised that we can use apostrophe s. That is to say, we could translate this sentence as the master's slave. So what we've done here is we've used apostrophe s to show that the master possesses the slave, instead of using the word of, which is a bit clunky in English in terms of when somebody is possessing something else, since when somebody possesses something else, we don't typically use the word of anymore. Think about it. Would you say the whiteboard of David, or would you say David's whiteboard? You would probably say David's whiteboard. However, in Greek, the genitive should be translated literally at first, using the word of, and then you can take that literal translation, and if somebody is possessing something, then you can make it sound more stylish. You can realise, I can make this sound nicer by using apostrophe s, or, as the case may be, s apostrophe. Because when the possessor is plural, so for instance, if this was the slave of the masters in the plural, if multiple masters owned this slave, then in English we would write the master's apostrophe slave. We would put the apostrophe after the s if the possessor were plural. But in this case, we know it's just one master that owns the slave, because it's tou, which is masculine genitive singular. We know from the singular part that it's just one master, and therefore we've just put apostrophe s rather than s apostrophe, which would be used for plural possessors, except in the case of a few irregular nouns. Irregular nouns in English, that is. So for instance, with the word women, we do still use apostrophe s because the noun women is already plural. But with most nouns, with regular nouns, we use apostrophe s for the singular when somebody possesses something, or s apostrophe for the plural when numerous people possess something. Let's look at a second example now. And now note that all of the genitives in this video will be genitives of possession. So there will be ones that you should literally translate using the word of, but then you should convert them into more natural English using apostrophe s or s apostrophe. But literally, you should translate them using the word of at first. And in fact, when the genitive means of in a different sense, such as the of partition, which is where you say, for instance, some of the slaves, where you're selecting a portion of a group, that phrase of the slaves would be in the genitive, and in that case, it is appropriate to leave the word of there. There is no way of making it sound more natural in English. And so when the genitive case is being used to mean of in a sense other than possession, in those cases, you should actually leave the word of before the noun. But possession is unique in that we should translate it literally using the word of at first, and then after that we should convert it into more natural English. But as I've said, when the genitive is used to mean the other senses of the word of, such as partition, you should leave the word of before the genitive noun. So let's look at a second example. So this second example is he epistolaire tes chores. And if you know your forms of the definite article, you will spot right away that this is feminine nominative singular, and therefore both the definite article and the noun are feminine nominative singular. And so the letter must be the subject of the sentence. But here we just have a phrase. If there were a full sentence, we know that the letter would be the subject. And then we have tes chores. We know that tes is the feminine genitive singular definite article, and therefore chores must also be feminine genitive singular. And we know that chore means girl, and therefore this should be translated as the letter of the girl, or in more natural English, the girl's letter. So there's the literal translation, the letter of the girl, with he epistolaire meaning the letter and tes chores meaning of the girl. And here is the more stylish, natural translation, the girl's letter. And if you want, we can mark the literal translation by writing L-I-T with a dot for literally, and then we could put I-E, which means that is to say. It means id est in Latin, which means that is, and you understand to say. It's when you're specifying what you mean by something. So literally, this means the letter of the girl, but that is to say, the girl's letter. Okay, let's look at a plural example now. So we've still got the letter, but let's make it the letter of the girls. So now we have he epistolaire ton choron. And we know that ton is genitive plural. It's immediately recognisable because ton is the genitive plural form of all three genders. But because the noun chore is feminine, we know that here it's feminine genitive plural. And because it's genitive plural, we know that this is now the letter of the girls in the plural. Because remember, if the definite article is feminine genitive plural, then this noun choron, whether or not we know how it changes its endings, must also be feminine genitive plural. The definite article is a key. And now, by the way, I've switched to using a new pen, and I've noticed that ton choron is much more vivid than he epistolaire. And that's fitting, really, because maybe it's like we're highlighting the genitive phrase in the sentence, you know. We've unintentionally made the genitive phrase bold, because this is our focus for the lesson. We're focusing on genitives, whereas this is a nominative phrase. So anyway, we will literally translate this as the letter of the girls, and I will put lit with a dot for the literal translation. But we can put this in more natural English as the girl's letter. And note that the apostrophe is after the S, and that lets us know that this letter is owned by multiple girls, not just one. And once again, I can add IE, meaning that is to say, with the stylish natural translation. And I should say you should always aim to translate Greek into natural English. So I think you should now have a pretty good idea about how to translate the genitive. Remember to use the word of when translating the genitive, and then if you realise that it means of in the sense of possession, you should use apostrophe S or S apostrophe to make it sound more natural. As I've said, please be aware that there are other uses of the genitive, but we shall cover those in the future. But now we're going to talk about the three ways in which a genitive noun can be deployed in Greek. We have already seen one of these ways. I'm going to write our first example back up on the board to illustrate this. Here is our first example, chodoulos tou despotou, which I hope you remember means the slave of the master, or in more natural English, the master's slave. Now here we've got a nominative combination of definite article and noun, and here we've got a genitive combination of definite article and noun. And now note that this need not actually be nominative. The thing that comes before the word of in the literal translation could be in any case. So for example, you could say, I see the slave of the master, or I see the master's slave. And there, this would actually be ton doulon, it would be in the accusative. But this would still be genitive. So be aware that this need not be nominative, and I'll illustrate that more later on. But for now, just note that we've got this combination of definite article and noun in one case. In this instance, it's the nominative case. And over here, we've got a combination of definite article and noun in the genitive case. And so the way the genitive noun and definite article have been deployed here is just by sticking them in the sentence. We have literally just added the genitive phrase to the sentence. We've just taken the genitive phrase and we've put it into the sentence. This is the first way of deploying a genitive noun in ancient Greek. Let's call this the plain deployment, okay? Because it's just plainly been added. It has simply been added to the sentence. It hasn't been deployed in any fancy way. It's just been added to the sentence. So the first way of deploying genitive nouns in ancient Greek is the plain method. That is to say, simply adding the genitive noun or the genitive definite article and noun to the sentence. You just stick them into the sentence as another component of that sentence. And it's worth noting that in the case of a plain deployment, the genitive phrase need not be on this side of the phrase that it applies to. So for instance, this sentence could be tou despotou ho doulos. You could see the genitive on the other side, and it would still mean the slave of the master, or the master's slave. Because it's the cases that matter. The word order is flexible in Greek. There are some restrictions on word order, but in general it's very flexible. I've added the word deployment there to make it clear we're talking about ways of deploying genitive nouns. So the first is the plain deployment, where you just stick the genitive noun or the genitive phrase into the sentence. The second method of deploying a genitive noun is using what we call the sandwich construction. Let's look at how to say the slave of the master, or the master's slave, using the sandwich construction. Now we have the phrase ho tou despotou doulos. So what has happened here? Ho, the masculine nominative singular form of the definite article, is next to tou, the masculine genitive singular form of the definite article. So we've got two definite articles next to each other. To explain what's happened here, I'm going to point out the fact that ho is applying to doulos still, and tou despotou is the genitive phrase. So you can see that the genitive phrase has been sandwiched in between the definite article and noun that is supposed to go with that definite article. That is why it's called the sandwich construction. Other people call this a genitive sandwich. And it's worth noting that we see this sandwich construction in other places in Greek, not just with genitives. So it's a useful construction to get your head around. And the idea is that information, in this case the genitive phrase, is sandwiched between a definite article and its noun. And this is just another method of deploying the genitive. And the reason I'm saying that is because I want to emphasize this means exactly the same thing as it did in the plain deployment. So this still means the slave of the master, but it's just deployed in a slightly different way. The genitive, instead of being deployed in the plain manner of simply adding it to the sentence, has instead been sandwiched in between the noun and definite article. As a visual illustration, these two are going together, while this genitive phrase is sandwiched in the middle. So you first need to translate this combination of definite article and noun, and then you translate the genitive phrase using of at first. And if somebody is possessing something, if it's of in the sense of possession, then you can make it sound more natural. But this still means the slave of the master, or in other words, the master's slave. The third and final way of deploying a genitive noun in an ancient Greek sentence is using what's called the repeated article construction. And when it says article, it means the definite article. So we know from the name that in this construction, a definite article is being repeated somehow. But let's look at an example for the specifics. And let's use that same sentence, the slave of the master, or the master's slave. So this is that same phrase in the repeated article construction. It's the phrase, the slave of the master, or in more natural English, the master's slave, but using the repeated article construction. So what do we have here? We have ho doulos ho tu despotou. So you can see that the definite article of doulos, the masculine nominative singular definite article, has been repeated. And then you've got the genitive phrase following that repeated definite article. So instead of sandwiching the genitive in here, we have repeated the definite article and then put the genitive phrase after the repeated definite article. And what this repeated definite article is being used to do is to essentially add more information about something that's already been mentioned. So the slave has already been mentioned, and the ho is telling you something extra about that slave. We might think of this repeated definite article as meaning the one. So therefore this would be the slave, the one of the master. That's how we could think of it. However, you would translate it literally as the slave, and then you would realise that this is also about that same slave because it's the repeated definite article. And you would translate it as the slave of the master, or the master's slave. So this is the exact same phrase in terms of the meaning, but we have now seen this phrase in three different forms according to the three different ways that a genitive noun might be deployed in an ancient Greek sentence. And those ways are the plain deployment, the sandwich construction, and the repeated article construction. And please note that you also see two definite articles next to each other in the repeated article construction. That's the repeated article construction, but in the sandwich construction, you have not got an article being repeated. You've just got the definite article, the genitive sandwiched in the middle, and then the noun that is going with that initial definite article on the other side of the genitive. What this means is that if you've got two definite articles next to each other, and the first of them is a repeated definite article, then you're dealing with the repeated article construction. But if you've got two definite articles next to each other, and the first of them is not a repeated definite article, then you're dealing with the sandwich construction. So you've now learned the three ways that a genitive noun, or in our case, a genitive definite article and noun combination, can be deployed. And I think it would be very nice for you to have a visual summary of those three ways. And here is that summary, as if by magic. Here you've got the three methods of deploying a genitive noun in a sentence in ancient Greek. You've got the plain deployment, where you just stick the genitive noun or phrase into the sentence. You just add it to the sentence, and that's it. So, ho doulos tu despotou, the slave of the master. And note that in the plain deployment, the genitive part can go either side of the noun that it applies to. In fact, it can actually be sometimes quite far removed from the noun that it applies to. But the point is, the genitive phrase is just put into the sentence and it's not deployed in any special way. Whereas in the second method, which is the sandwich construction, the genitive is inserted in between the definite article and the noun. So you'll take this in the following order: ho doulos, the slave, tu despotu, of the master. And then the third and final method is using the repeated article construction, where you have got the definite article of the noun that the genitive phrase is applying to repeated with the genitive phrase following that repeated definite article. So this would be the slave, the one of the master, but you could just say the slave of the master. Understanding that this ho is giving you some extra information about the doulos, the slave who's already been mentioned and whose definite article has already appeared. And both the sandwich construction and repeated article construction are also used elsewhere in Greek, and so they are good to learn in their own right. The idea in the sandwich construction is that you've got some extra information sandwiched in between a definite article and a noun. And the idea in the repeated article construction is that additional information about something can be given by repeating the definite article of that thing and then adding the additional information. But in our case, that additional information is a genitive phrase, because today we're dealing with the genitive case. Okay, I'm now going to test your knowledge of those methods of deploying genitive nouns or genitive phrases by writing the phrase the letter of the girl or the girl's letter using those three different methods of deployment. But you will have to spot which method of deployment I've used in each case. So here are those three phrases. They all mean the letter of the girl or the girl's letter, but each of them uses a different method of deploying the genitive. Now this isn't a formal exercise, just some quick practice, but pause the video and see if you can recognise which method of deploying the genitive is being used in each case. To reveal the answers, in the first case we have her des corres epistoler. Here we can see that the sandwich construction is being used. It's a genitive sandwich. And we can see that because we have two definite articles next to each other and we don't have any repeated definite article. So that's one way that you could spot that it's a genitive sandwich, because you've got two definite articles next to each other without any repeated definite article following it. But you might also spot that her here is going with epistoler, since you know that her is feminine nominative singular. And although you haven't learned how nouns change their endings yet, I've taught you epistoler as the standard, that is nominative form, of the word letter, epistoler. So you know that this feminine nominative singular definite article would have to be going with this nominative noun. Whereas you've got this genitive phrase, tes corres, shoved in the middle. I should say sandwiched in the middle, really. So the first one was the sandwich construction. And now it'll become even easier to spot which of these methods of deployment is being used once you know how nouns change their endings. Then things will become even more apparent. But for now, you could have spotted it because you know that you've got two definite articles next to each other here and you've got no repeated definite article following. Whereas if we look at number two, her epistoler, her tes corres, you can see we've got two definite articles next to each other here, and we can see that one of them is a repeated definite article. It is the repeated feminine nominative singular definite article. And therefore we know that number two is using the repeated article construction. Because here we have the phrase the letter in the nominative, and then we've got the feminine nominative singular definite article repeated, and the genitive phrase following that repeated definite article, because what this repeated article is doing is giving us some additional detail, and in this case the additional detail is that the letter is the one of the girl. Literally, it's the letter, the one of the girl. And in the final case, tes corres her epistolaire, we of course had the plain deployment, because we have a nominative phrase here and we have a genitive phrase here. The genitive phrase has simply been added into the sentence, not in any fancy way, but just plainly or simply, it's been inserted into the sentence. There's no repeated article, you haven't got two definite articles next to each other, so we know it's the plain deployment. One thing that might have raised your eyebrow about this is that the genitive phrase here comes before the nominative phrase. I did warn you that with a plain deployment of the genitive, this can happen. The genitive phrase could be on either side of the phrase that it is applying to. And if you want a secret about Greek, the genitive phrase can actually be quite far removed from the phrase or the noun that it applies to. But for now, it will be on one side or the other of the phrase that it applies to. And when I say phrase, by the way, in this instance I'm just meaning combination of definite article and noun. Since this whole phrase, the definite article and the noun, is nominative, in fact feminine nominative singular, and this whole phrase, the definite article and the noun, is feminine genitive singular. And remember, when we do the exercise, you might have a genitive phrase in the plural. So you have to watch out for that genitive plural definite article. Use it as a key. So for instance, in this phrase we have hai ton koron epistolai. Here you can see that we have two definite articles next to each other. But we have not got any repeated definite article in the phrase. And therefore we know that we're dealing with a genitive sandwich. We're dealing with the sandwich construction. And so we know that this part in the middle must be the genitive phrase, and hai must be going with epistolai. And we know that hai is feminine nominative plural, and therefore epistolai is also feminine nominative plural. And so this must mean the letters, and since ton is here feminine genitive plural, since it's going with a feminine noun, because of the fact that it's genitive, we know to translate it using the word of, literally at first. And because it's plural, we know that this means the girls. And therefore we should translate this as the letters of the girls, or the girls' letters, with the apostrophe after the S, because it's a group of possessors, not just one. Okay, it's time for you to practice what you have learned more formally this time, with the first exercise I've devised for this lesson. I'm going to give you 5 phrases, okay, not full sentences, just phrases consisting of a nominative phrase and a genitive phrase. The genitive phrases will be deployed in a variety of ways, but just translate the full phrase, so the nominative phrase and the genitive phrase together. So you won't have a full sentence, but it will just be something akin to the letter of the girl, or more naturally, the girl's letter. Now note, please do translate these phrases literally at first, but then in your final answer, give the most natural translation you can, because we always want to translate Greek into natural English. And finally, after you translate one of the phrases, state which method of deployment of the genitive is being used. So whether it's the plain deployment, the sandwich construction, or the repeated article construction. Specify which one it uses after you translate the phrase. Okay, here are the 5 phrases. So have a go at translating these literally at first, but then in your final translation, translate them into natural English, and then specify which method of deployment of the genitive is being used in each phrase. Okay, I'm going to start revealing the answers now. The first one was her boer her tu xenu. The natural translation of this phrase is the foreigner's shout. It literally means the shout of the foreigner, but we would translate it into natural English as the foreigner's shout. And we know that the genitive is being deployed with the repeated article construction, which I've abbreviated as RAC. We know it's being deployed in that way because here we have the feminine nominative singular definite article, and we can see that it's being repeated and that you've got the masculine genitive singular definite article right next to it. So this literally means the shout, the one of the foreigner. But we would translate it as the foreigner's shout. Okay, the second one was to ploion tu didaskalou. In natural English, this would be the teacher's ship. And you can see that we've got the neuter nominative singular definite article here and the masculine genitive singular definite article here. We haven't got any definite article that is repeated, and we haven't got any definite articles side by side. And therefore we have the plain deployment of the genitive here. This genitive phrase, tu didaskalou, has simply been added into the sentence. And therefore I have put PD there for plain deployment. We've got one nominative phrase here, the ship, and a genitive phrase here, of the teacher. In natural English, the teacher's ship. Let's look at the third one. The third one was ho tu despotu hippos. This should have been translated into natural English as the master's horse. And we can see that we've got two definite articles next to each other and no repeated definite article, and therefore we're dealing with the sandwich construction. I've put SC for sandwich construction. You can see that we've got ho going with hippos, the horse, and we've got the genitive phrase sandwiched in the middle, meaning of the master. Or in natural English, the master's horse. Let's now look at number 4. Number 4 was ta ton xenon ploia. Here we had to be careful about the number of the definite articles, because this should have been translated into natural English as the foreigner's ships. And note that the apostrophe is after the S because it is multiple foreigners that own the ships. Ta is neuter nominative plural, and it's next to the masculine genitive plural definite article ton. We haven't got any repeated definite articles, and therefore it's a genitive sandwich. So this phrase is genitive, and we know that ta is nominative, and therefore the nominative noun must be here. We know that ta is plural, and so we know ploia from ploion is also plural. And so this means the ships of the foreigners, literally, but in more natural English, the foreigners' ships. And because the genitive phrase is sandwiched in the middle, we are clearly dealing with a sandwich construction. So I put that there, SC, sandwich construction. Okay, the last one, number 5. Tu paidiu her epistolaire. This should have been translated into natural English as the little child's letter. And we can see, because of the fact that we've got two separate forms of the definite article with no repeated definite articles, that we are dealing with the plain deployment of the genitive here, since we know that tu is neuter genitive singular in this case, since it's going with paidiu, paidion being a neuter noun. And we can see that phrase tu paidiu has just been added to the sentence. There's not been any repeated definite article, and tu paidiu isn't sandwiched in between her and epistolaire. So we know it's just the plain deployment of the genitive, and therefore I shall put PD for plain deployment. To confirm then, we had the letter here and of the little child here. Okay, so that's all 5 phrases done. I hope that you successfully translated them into natural English and identified which method of deployment of the genitive is being used in each one. But if not, I hope that you realise what you did wrong and that you can learn from that in the future. But now, before we go on to the next exercise, I need to explain a crucial point. And that is, so far, we've only seen phrases involving the genitive, and those phrases have consisted of a nominative phrase and a genitive phrase. But the thing is, as I said before, the genitive need not apply to a nominative phrase. And by phrase, I just mean a definite article and noun combination, but in the future you might just be dealing with nouns without definite articles. But the same point applies. The genitive need not apply to a nominative. The genitive, the of phrase, can go with a phrase in any case, or a noun in any case. And I'm going to illustrate that point now, before we do an exercise dealing with full sentences involving genitive nouns. Because it's really important to know that genitive nouns can apply to phrases of any case. But of course, we haven't properly met the dative yet, and so I'm just going to illustrate this point by using an example where the genitive applies to an accusative phrase. Okay, we actually have a full sentence here, and this sentence involves a nominative phrase, an accusative phrase, and a genitive phrase. And we shall see that the genitive phrase is actually applying to the accusative phrase. This sentence is ho despoters horai ten tes chores epistolan. So, ho is the masculine nominative singular form of the definite article, and it's directly followed by the noun despoters. And therefore we know that the master must be the subject. He's doing the action. Next we have a verb. In fact, it's the verb in the sentence, and that is horai, which means he, she, it sees. In this instance, we know that the master is the one doing the seeing. So this sentence so far is the master sees, and then we have ten, which is the feminine accusative singular form of the definite article, and next to it we've got tes. But we have not got any repeated definite article, and therefore we know that this must be a genitive sandwich. The sandwich construction is being used to deploy a genitive phrase here. And so we know that tes chores is a genitive phrase sandwiched in between ten, the definite article, and epistolan, the noun. And here both the definite article and the noun are feminine accusative singular, not nominative. And yet the genitive phrase is sandwiched in between them. So this shows that the genitive phrase can apply to nouns or phrases in cases other than the nominative. And you might think, well, how would we translate this all together? And that would be, the master sees the letter of the girl. Or, in more natural English, the master sees the girl's letter. So I put the literal translation there on the board for you. The master sees the letter of the girl. That is to say, in more natural English, the master sees the girl's letter. And we know it's just one girl that owns it because it's feminine genitive singular. Just to summarise how we know it means that, we can know that from the definite articles alone. We know that ho is masculine nominative singular, and therefore the master's doing the action, he's the one doing the seeing. We know that this verb horai means he, she, it sees. So that tells us what the action is that the master is doing. The master sees. Because ten epistolan is accusative, we know that the letter is the direct object. It's on the receiving end of his seeing. It is the thing that the master is seeing. And then tes chores, we know that tes is feminine genitive singular, and so chores must also be feminine genitive singular. And we know that we should literally translate the genitive using of, which we did here. So we know that the letter is the letter of the girl. That is to say, it's owned by the girl. And once we realise that, we can render it more naturally as the master sees the girl's letter. Okay, to conclude my introduction to the genitive case, we are going to do one more exercise. And in this exercise, I'm going to give you 6 sentences to translate. And these will be full sentences, and the genitive phrase in them could apply to a nominative noun or an accusative noun. So in each sentence, you'll need to watch out for which of these the genitive phrase applies to. And I'll just like you to translate these phrases into natural English. You don't need to specify which method of deploying the genitive is being used in each one of them. And remember, translate these sentences literally at first, using the word of when you translate the genitive phrase, and then convert it into more natural English. But there's one final thing. I'm now going to introduce you to a new verb, and this verb will appear in one of the sentences that I'm about to give you. And that is the verb akawar. Akawar is the verb to hear or to listen to. And of course, in this form, it means I hear or I listen to, because this is the first person singular present indicative active. However, when you're meeting a new verb in a vocabulary list or dictionary, they'll give the first person singular form, which you know means I do that thing, but they will just give the basic meaning. When I say basic, I mean the meaning without the person. So for instance, akawar in a dictionary would just say hear or listen to, even though you know this precise form actually means I hear or I listen to. But that's the form that's given in a dictionary because it's the standard form of the verb. The present indicative first person singular is considered to be the normal or standard form of a verb. Anyway, akawar is the verb to hear or to listen to. And you might be able to remember its meaning if you transliterate the verb stem. If you transliterate the stem aku, you get in English aku, and this gives us words like acoustic, with the adjective acoustic meaning relating to sound. Or in the case of an acoustic guitar, there the word acoustic means only having the natural sound of the guitar without any electrical amplification. So that word acoustic is always to do with sound in some sense. And we get it from akawar, the verb to hear or listen to. So add that verb to your vocabulary list and prepare to see it in one of the 6 sentences that I shall put on the board now. Okay, so here are these 6 sentences. Please have a go at translating them. Remember to translate them literally at first, but then put your final translation in natural English, because that is what will appear on the board in just a moment, a natural English translation. A translation that sounds natural in English, but is also true to the Greek. Okay, I'm going to start revealing the correct translations now. The first one was Chodoulos luei tontes chores hippon. And this should have been translated as the slave releases the girl's horse, or the slave is releasing the girl's horse. Remember, with present tense verbs, you can either say does that thing or is doing that thing. We knew it meant that because we've got the slave in the nominative here, which we know from the definite article. Then we've got the verb releases in the third person singular. Then we've got 2 definite articles next to each other, but we've got no repeated definite article. We know that this definite article is masculine accusative singular, and this one is feminine genitive singular. And so we know, because of the lack of a repeated definite article, that we're dealing with a genitive sandwich here. And so ton must be going with hippon, and tes chores is a genitive phrase that has been sandwiched in the middle. And so we know that this means the slave releases the horse of the girl. Literally, we would say the horse of the girl, but then you hopefully made it sound more natural and said the slave releases the girl's horse with apostrophe s. And we know that it's just one girl because the definite article is feminine genitive singular, not plural. Okay, number 2 was Hoixenoi horosi ta ploia ta ton despoton. And this should have been translated into natural English as the foreigners see the master's ships. And notice that the apostrophe is after the s because it is multiple masters that possess the ships. You could have also had the strangers see the master's ships, because we know that xenos can mean either foreigner or stranger. We know it meant that because we had the foreigners as the subject, as indicated by the masculine nominative plural definite article. And then we had horosi, which is the verb to see in the present indicative active third person plural. So the foreigners see. Then we had the ships, ta ploia. We know it's plural because a plural definite article is used. And then we've got that definite article repeated here, so we know that we're being given some more information here. And since we know torn is genitive plural, we know that this is the repeated article construction being used to deploy a genitive phrase. And so, overall, we know it means the foreigners see the ships, literally, the ones of the masters. However, I hope you worded it more nicely than that in the end and said the foreigners see the masters' ships. Now, it wouldn't be wrong if you left it as the ships of the masters, and in fact, in some contexts, using the word of might sound equally nice to using apostrophe s or s apostrophe, as the case may be. And this might be one such instance. I think the ships of the masters doesn't sound that bad. However, ideally, in most cases, you want to use apostrophe s or s apostrophe. Okay, let's do the third one. Ten epistolean perei hotu despotu doulos. And this should have been translated into natural English as the master's slave carries the letter, or is carrying the letter. We know it meant that because at the start we had ten epistolean, and we know that ten is feminine accusative singular, so although it's at the start, we know that this has to be the object. The letter has to be on the receiving end of the action of the verb. And then after that we had the verb he, she, it carries. It's pero, but it's in the third person singular, perei. And then we had a masculine nominative singular definite article next to a masculine genitive singular definite article. And we don't have any repeated definite articles, and so we know this must be a genitive sandwich, and so we know hot is going with doulos, and tou despotou has been sandwiched in the middle. So hot doulos means the slave, tou despotou means of the master, or in other words, the master's slave. And because of the nominative nature of the slave, because the slave is the subject, we know to literally translate this as the slave of the master carries the letter. Or in other words, the master's slave carries the letter. Let's try the fourth one now. To paidion ten tu doulou boan akue. I hope you spotted this new verb, and I hope you translated it into natural English as the little child hears the slave's shout. And we know it meant that because to paidion, out of context, could be either nominative or accusative, because to is used as the neuter nominative and accusative singular definite article. But then we see that we've got an object indicated by ten, and once we see that tu is next to it and that there is no repeated definite article, ten is not repeated, we know that we've got a genitive sandwich here. Tu doulou has been sandwiched in the middle of ten boan. So we know the shout is in the accusative, the shout is the object, then we've got of the slave, and since it's in the middle of the shout, we know to translate this literally as the shout of the slave. Then at the end we've got the verb akue, which means he, she, it hears or listens to. And so once we realise that the shout of the slave is the object and he, she, it is hearing it, we know that to paidion must be the subject. It must actually be in the nominative. And so we translate this as the little child hears the shout of the slave, literally, but we would reword that as the little child hears the slave's shout. The fifth one was ten epistolen tu doulou perei hercorrer. This should have been translated into natural English as the girl carries the slave's letter. And we knew it meant that because we had the letter in the accusative at the start, and then we had tu doulou. We had a genitive phrase on its own, not deployed in any fancy way. And since it's next to the letter, we know that this literally means the letter of the slave, and the letter's in the accusative, so it's the object. Then we've got the verb perei, which means he, she, it carries. Then right at the end, we've got hercorrer, and since we know her is feminine nominative singular, we know that the girl, the correr, must be the subject. So she is the one that's doing the carrying. And so we translate this as the girl carries the letter of the slave, literally, but then we reword that into nicer English as the girl carries the slave's letter, or is carrying the slave's letter. Okay, let's do the final one, number 6. Ta paidia tous ton xenon hippus luei. You should have translated this one into natural English as the little children release the foreigners' horses. Firstly, we had ta paidia, which could be nominative or accusative. We don't know until we've read the rest of the sentence. But we do know that it's plural, ta is plural, and therefore we know that it must be the little children rather than the little child. And then we've got tous ton xenon hippus. We've got tous, which we know is masculine accusative plural, and ton, which is genitive plural. Here it's masculine genitive plural since it's going with xenon. But in any case, since we've got two definite articles next to each other, one of which is genitive, and we haven't got this one as a repeated definite article, we know that we're dealing with a genitive sandwich. We've got the sandwich construction here, and therefore we know that this means the horses of the foreigners, and that these horses, because tous is accusative, must be the object. They're on the receiving end of the verb, and right at the end of the sentence we've got the verb luei, which means he, she, it releases. And in light of all of that, we know to translate this sentence as the little children release the horses of the foreigners. Or in other words, the little children release the foreigners' horses. Notice the apostrophe is after the S because these horses are owned by multiple foreigners or strangers. You could say strangers instead, because without any context, we don't know if the word xenos means foreigner or stranger. But this sentence was tricky because we had a third person singular verb with a neuter plural subject. So if you did not know that rule, which I taught you in the last lesson, then you might think, why isn't this luusin? Why isn't it third person plural? And the answer to that is because it's got a neuter plural subject, and neuter plural subjects take singular verbs. Luei is what we call a schnurb. Please remember that's not an actual technical term, by the way, but it's useful. Anyway, ta paidia is a neuter plural subject going with a third person singular verb, so the little children release the horses, so we had to recognise that the horses were in the plural as well as accusative, of the foreigners. So we also had to recognise that it was the foreigners rather than just the foreigner. So there was a schnurb to recognise with a neuter plural subject, and you also had to recognise an accusative plural and a genitive plural. So there were lots of plurals there, and you had a schnurb used for good measure. You had a third person singular verb that's third person singular because it has a neuter plural subject. But anyway, that is going to wrap up our lesson for today. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you all for your very kind words and your support. I hope that you're finding these lessons useful. But for now, I fear I must say goodbye, but next time, in lesson 13, we shall be looking at the dative case. Like this one, it will be an introductory lesson, and we'll still be using the definite article as a key. But quite soon after that, we will be diving in to the endings of nouns. That is, we'll be looking at how nouns change their endings, because you don't always have the definite article here to help you. But anyway, next time we'll look at the dative case, but for now, please keep revising, make sure you know those forms of the definite article off by heart, and keep up the good work. See you again soon.